there's been a condition diagnosed for speakers at this year's Marxism. It's finally got a name. It's called pre-Marxism tension. And I've been suffering from it considerably. The course is on Marxist economic theory, the exposition of Marxist capital. 4 talks at least are allowed for this. I've got in one talk to talk about all the books that Marx didn't write. This is somewhat difficult in 40 minutes. However, I'll do my best. If I don't finish, I don't finish. The chairman will just stop me at the appropriate moment. Now, what I want to argue is that, firstly, the obvious thing, Capital was Marx's masterpiece. But I then want to go on and say it is a systematically unfinished work. Now, this is if anybody's ever read it, it's obvious in one sense that it's unfinished. Marx only managed to get volume 1 of what we've got to press in his own lifetime. Volumes 2 and 3 were left in manuscript form, Engels edited them, and he published them after Marx's death in 1883. And if you read to the end of volume 3, just when it's beginning to get exciting, there's a chapter called Classes, and Marx says you can't approach class in this way, we have to approach it in the following. And then it says, and here the manuscript breaks off. So at this point I could rest my case and go home and say Marx's Capital is an unfinished work. But unfortunately I want to take the argument a little bit further than that. Now, in some of his earlier writings, his masses of notebooks that he wrote, in preparation for actually working on Capital itself, he put forward a number of schemes for the whole work. And generally, in the late 1850s, there was a 6-book scheme which he suggested he was going to work towards. Volume 1 was going to be about capital. Volume 2 was going to be about landed property. Volume 3 was going to be about wage labour. Volume 4 was going to be about the state. Volume 5 was going to be about international relations. And Volume 6 was going to be about the world market and crises and the supersession of the whole system. That's quite a lot. That last book was obviously going to be quite considerable. Now, some commentators say that Marx changed his mind, that in fact when he came to write Capital he'd abandoned these earlier and overambitious schemes, and other people say, well, if you look at the internal evidence, you'll find Marx at various points in Capital itself saying, this of course will have to be discussed in a continuation of the work and so on. The truth is that the academics have argued about whether or not Marx really did intend to continue with the full diet, as it were, of the work. And you can't decide, ultimately, on the basis of the internal evidence. There's no letter anywhere, no scribble on a piece of paper. All his scribbles have been preserved, more or less. You know, there's 40-odd volumes of Marx's scribbles and writings and so on. Every postcard he ever sent to anybody is somewhere to be found, if he sent one, in his collected works. And you can't tell. You have to decide about this question, not in terms of, you know, the bibliographical evidence, as it were. You have to decide in terms of what the logic of the work was, what the aim of the work was, what the method of the whole work was, whether it's unfinished. And in the end, you have to decide, not for Marx, you have to decide for us. Do we need to have Marx's Capital continued for us in the latter part of the 20th century? In terms of the political problems that we face and our understanding of the world, is Capital a satisfactory work? Is it a completed work for our purposes? And I want to argue that it isn't, that it does need finishing. I want to argue something quite silly. You know, if you ever looked at Lenin's philosophical notebooks, he read Hegel and then said, unless you read Hegel, you can't understand Marx's Capital. Therefore, for the last 50 years, nobody has understood Marx's Capital. I want to argue, unless you try to write all the bits that Marx didn't write, then you can't understand Marx's Capital, which is even more silly. Now, let's be clear what Marx's aim was in Capital. Capital was a work of revolutionary politics. This is not immediately apparent when you open it and you start reading. You immediately find yourself in dense, foggy concepts for the first time. You wonder what on earth is going on in this book when you first read it. It's not like reading the Communist Manifesto. What Marx was trying to do was a number of things at the same time. He was trying to show how the whole system of capitalism works. And in order to do that, he had to attack a whole tradition of trying to understand capitalism before himself, the tradition of the classical political economists. That all the false ideas and the false assumptions and impressions that people had had, and the false theories that people had had about capitalism, he had to confront in the course of developing his own ideas. he had to show, it was crucial because he was a revolutionary, he had to show that one of the assumptions that all the classical political economists made was wrong, namely that capitalism was a natural, inevitable system. He had to show that it was a historical system, that it had not always existed, and indeed that it was capable of being overthrown, that it would not always exist. And he had to break up their concepts to show how they had how their assumptions about it being a natural system were wrong and wrongly founded, which involved him in some extremely complicated arguments at times. He had to show, obviously, as a revolutionary, that capitalism as a system needed to be overthrown, and he also had to show that it was capable of being overthrown, that within capitalism itself, forces were indeed developed in the shape of the working class, which were more and more capable of destroying it and replacing it with socialist and communist society. And finally, he also, in the process, had to deal with wrong ideas, current in the workers' movement, and socialist ideas and so on, wrong ideas about how to transform the system. Insufficient ideas, the ideas of the utopians, the ideas of the 19th century cooperators and so on, and show how their systematic misunderstanding of capitalism led to the mistakes in their politics. All of this he had to do at the same time. And all these balls he's juggling in the air at the same time as he's working through capital. But the thing that gives it its focus is its revolutionary aim. The revolutionary reconstitution of society by the working class is the aim of the work. And the work is addressed to the advanced workers, the thinking workers, the leaders in the workers' movement, to try to convince them that they must understand capitalism better and so on. Now, the problems that Marx faces in doing this are very considerable. Firstly, he had to master an enormous mass of material. And so, all these stories about Marx sitting in the British Museum library, getting boils on his bum, reading obscure works from the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. You look at the end of any of the volumes of Capital, the lists of things, the pages and pages of works that Marx has consulted and refers to in each of the volumes. It's astonishing, his rate of work. I mean, the man was most impressive just in terms of the rate of work when he really got his steam up. When he was writing the Grundrisse, I calculated, he was writing 4,000 words a day, including Sundays. And if anybody's ever tried to keep that rate of work up, you'll know that for most of us ordinary mortals, it's more or less impossible. I've never managed it. I must say, I'm a lazy sod. That's one thing, to master the material. Then he's got the problem of presenting it in a coherent and artistic way. And this was a problem that he grappled with continuously. The problem was that if you, as he put it, you can't present everything at once, because if you do, you just have a chaotic account of everything, and you can't make sense of it. You have to begin in one place and gradually present more and more aspects of capitalism in a systematic way. And so his method of working, of presenting things, was to begin with one key aspect of capitalism. So he begins with the commodity, for example. And then you add in another aspect. And you gradually move, as he puts it, from the abstract, from the most general characteristics of the system, more and more towards, he's got various images for this, from the depth to the surface, from the abstract to the concrete, from the general to the particular, and so on. Gradually come to all the complexity of the real world, starting from a relatively simple starting point. Gradually tracing all the interconnections. You look at one side of a question, then you introduce the other side, and you show that the first side that you presented was only one side. And so gradually the contradictions of the system are revealed, and the complexities of the system are revealed, and so on. And at each step, Marx tries to show that another step is necessary. And his method is to present around it. For example, he explores the commodity, he explores the world of commodity production and commodity exchange, and he shows that the classical political economists who talked about this and talked about the market made a correct assumption. That in the world, fundamentally in the world of commodity exchange and the world of private property, the world of commodity production, everything is fair and equal. And everybody is free, and everybody makes contracts, and everybody treats everybody as an equal, and so on. And then he says, then there's a problem. Assuming that this is true, how the hell do we explain profits and rent and interest and massive inequality in the world if this is a world of equality? And he says, none of them has solved it. And so he says we have to look again at the commodity. There's another commodity that they haven't noticed, he says, which they've systematically misanalyzed. It's called labour power. And once he introduces the concept of labour power, he can then move on to introduce the sale of labour power by workers to capitalists, and he can introduce surplus value, the production of surplus value, the whole process of exploitation, and suddenly the world that he's previously described, the world of the liberal economists, the world where everything is free and equal, is suddenly transformed into a world of exploitation, where people are free and equal. Suddenly there are bosses and workers, there's no longer equality, there's despotism in the factory and not freedom, and so on and so on. Now, he makes move after move like this in Capital, gradually revealing more and more aspects of the capitalist economy. Now, all of this is wonderful. It's very difficult sometimes to follow, and it takes several times. You have to read through, and it's one of those thick books. Once you've read it, you then feel you didn't understand anything. You go back and gradually you learn more and more, and you come to admire Marx, I must say, more and more and more. Now, what I want to argue is that using Marx's own criteria, or one last thing, because Marx didn't assume, because in fact he argued very strongly it wasn't the case that capitalism was a natural system, that it was a historical system, it was a problem that it existed even, because it was against the interests of the overwhelming majority in society. There was a problem. How, you had to explain, was capitalism reproduced from day to day? What are all the mechanisms by which actually this system is reproduced? How does it work? How is it that we have to ask immediately pose all sorts of questions? How do workers come to accept it? How does it hide its reality from its participants? Why do workers accept exploitation? How does this system continue to constitute itself and reconstitute itself and to develop? Now, given that these are his questions and these are his problems, I want to suggest that on his own criteria, he didn't finish. He came nowhere near finishing the whole work. And basically what I want to argue is that at least 3 more books are required out of his scheme. There's arguments about some other parts which are more technical, and I don't think they matter so much. But in terms of the very politics of the work, and our own politics, Marx's Capital needs 3 more books at least. One of them is a book on labour. The second one is a book on the state, and the third is a book on the world economy. And what I want to do is to talk about those unwritten books. Now, all I can do really is to state the case for the absence of these books and why we need them. And to perhaps go a little way towards indicating some of the subject matter that would be included in those books, and rather nervously, I want to try and suggest how perhaps if he were around, I would have been very interested to discuss with him, I must confess, how we might have approached the question, begun at least the exploration of each of these themes. Okay, so this really is a daft talk. Not what Marx wrote, but what he might have written. Now, labour. This actually is the most controversial part of my argument, because I don't think anybody's going to dispute that we need a book about the state. Given the role of the state in modern capitalism, the absence of any discussion in Capital about the state, that we need a book on the world economy, obviously. A systematic discussion of those questions is needed. We all understand that. But what about the book on labour? If you read Capital, you will find it disappointing in one important respect, if you read it as a revolutionary socialist. Because it's very one-sided in its presentation. What Marx shows is that the whole basis of capitalism is the activity of workers. If it wasn't for the activity of workers, there would be no capital. There would be no value. There would be no surplus value. It is workers who produce capital. From day to day, every day they go to work, they produce capital, they produce surplus value. You may think that what workers in Ford are producing is cars. Actually, they're producing Henry Ford every day, reproducing him as their boss, reproducing the capitalist class through their activity. And he shows that the condition for them doing this is that they're permanently the dispossessed class, the class without property, the class that has no access to the means of production. And therefore they have to sell their labour power in order to produce capital, to produce surplus value and reproduce capital in capitalist society. He shows the working class in Capital mostly as a suffering and exploited class. But he doesn't show, most of the time, he doesn't show the working class as an active, struggling class. Now, sometimes he does. I mean, there's a marvellous chapter, for example, chapter 10 of volume 1 of Capital, which is about the struggle for the limiting of the working day in the middle of the 19th century in England. Brilliant chapter. In fact, if you want to have a dip into Capital, it's a very good place. It's sometimes been suggested a very good place to just go and have a dip, to read that chapter, get a sense of the way that Marx argues. There are other points. There's a moment in the beginning of volume 3 where he talks about the Lancashire cotton workers in the middle of in the period of the Civil War, when they were all laid off and so on, and he talks about how the bourgeois commentators described what splendid workers they were, and Marx says, I don't think so, I think they behaved like sheep, he said. Sort of a casual remark. Did they not behave, he says, like sheep? And so comment on the workers' struggle, but mostly the workers as an active struggling force do not appear in Capital. Systematically, the book is not centred on working class struggle. And essentially, I suppose what I want to say is that side needs to be developed. The book is one-sided. We have the capitalism viewed in a sense from the side of capital. It needs to be viewed again from the side of labour. And this, I think, would have to be the theme, essentially, of a book on labour. Now, why is it necessary? Well, one danger that we have is that, which is very apparent in a good deal of so-called Marxist literature, which comrades may have come across, is that in all sorts of fields of Marxist literature, not only about economics and economic theory, but all sorts of other issues, we find people presenting as Marxist theory what is really nothing to do with Marxism at all. What is actually the theory of elitism, of capitalist domination of the minds and spirits and lives of working class people, so that workers seem just to be played about with by the system, and to have no opinions, no struggle, no resistance, and so on. So you get books on education about how capitalism systematically miseducates workers and spoils their brains and so on. There's a million radical studies of the media which assume the media just pump like hypodermic syringes into workers' brains, and workers sit there and just accept all this stuff, and so on and so on and so on. You can go through field after field of Marxist sociological studies and so on, where this is apparent. Studies of the family, which just say the family is produced by capitalism without, the idea that workers might actually have a say in constructing their own families, and so on and so on. Studies of technology, where technology is just presented as workers being done by capitalism, and so on. So that's one danger, which we've inherited, in a sense, from the one-sidedness of capital. The other danger is, of course, that, and this again comes out in some time, that Marx's argument is that the working class is the force which will supersede capitalism. The problem is, and this is, it's what all Marxists know, but it doesn't really appear in capital. It appears, he pulls it out like a rabbit out of the hat, like a magician. At the end, one day he says you look forward to the time when the expropriators will be expropriated. But the force which is going to do it hasn't systematically been developed, in a sense, in capital. It comes at the end as a sort of splendid rhetorical flourish, but it isn't built into the heart of the work. You can't see it as a possibility in the heart of the work, that the working class actually is itself a developing force, and so on. Now, where would he be? So I'm arguing that this whole side of capitalism, our side of capitalism, if you like, the working class is a developing force with increasing capacity to destroy capitalism and found a new society, actually needs to be built into the structure of the work. And it needs to be done precisely in the way that Marx is suggesting. You look at one side of the question, then you look at the other. He didn't get to the other side. Now, how to approach it? I think possibly the starting point is to begin precisely with Marx's proposition that labour power is a commodity. And it needs to be explored more, this commodity, labour power. You see, Marx presents labour power as being a very peculiar and special commodity. It's unlike all other commodities, he says, because labour power is the only commodity which is on sale in capitalism. The capacity of workers, the power of workers to work, is the only commodity you can buy in capitalism which can produce more than its own value. It's the basis of capitalist surplus value production, and so on and so on. So he says it's peculiar in that sense. I want to say it's peculiar in several other respects. It's peculiar in a number of other respects. One I want to talk about in particular. And that is, of course, it's the only commodity on sale which has got a mind, which has got a will of its own, which has got involved in social relations, which has got emotions and feelings. You know, if you go and buy a carrot, you don't, I mean, there may be a vegetable liberation front will eventually emerge somewhere from the fragments, but at the moment we don't generally think of the potato, the carrot, or the razor blade, or whatever, as having minds and wills of their own. Perhaps if you're shaving after being drunk, you might think so, but the subjective side of this needs to be developed, of this peculiar commodity. You see, if labour power didn't have a subjective side, didn't have interests and will and intention and ideas and desires and so on, then, of course, capitalism would have no problems at all. It would be could run it a lot cheaper. You wouldn't need any foremen and supervisors and under-managers and deputy party secretaries and goodness knows what to control labour in the labour process. You don't have people to supervise, make sure that machines don't get out of line and go on strike and things like that. You don't have any of that apparatus. It's precisely needed to control workers. Capitalists in practice have to come to terms with the fact that one of the commodities they buy, they have to deal with in a quite different way from all the machines and raw materials that they buy. They have actually to come to terms with the subjective side of labour power, with the resistance and the will and the needs and so on of labour power. The activity of workers, we have to say, which needs to be, and this has to be developed with as much complexity as Marx developed, it seems to me. I mean, it's not, I'm spelling out an agenda rather than offering you a completed theory of this. The activity of the workers is the basis of the reproduction of capitalism. It's also, in Marx's account, one of the things which forces capitalism constantly to transform itself in order to adjust to the developing struggle of workers. And also, of course, for Marx, it is the means, the activity of workers is the means through which capitalism can be superseded, can be destroyed, done away with. Now, one of the things that has to be asked in terms of Marx's own approach is, how is labour power reproduced? Now, Marx makes a few cursory remarks about that because the centre of his attention in Capital is not on that question. But it has to be, in a book on labour, the centre of attention. And basically we have to say, I think, that labour power is reproduced outside the circuits of capital, outside the processes by which capital is constantly changing itself from money to commodities and then through the process of production into more commodities and more money. That's the circuits, the reproduction of capital, which goes round and round in an expanding circle. Outside that occurs the reproduction of labour power. There's another circuit which needs to be theorised, in a sense, through which workers reproduce themselves. They are paid wages with which they buy their necessities. They then reproduce themselves, not under the direct domination of capital. And then they return, having reproduced themselves, they're forced to return to meet the capitalist again, if you like, to sell their labour power, which they've reproduced outside capital, in a sense, outside the domination of capital. They have to re-enter the domination of the world of the domination of capital. There's a separate circuit. Now that circuit, it's possible to actually draw it in diagrammatic form and so on, but I don't want to, I'm pressed for time and I don't want to talk about that particularly today, but the point about this circuit is that the circuit of capital, we understand very well from Marx, is driven by the pressure of accumulation. Capitalists are forced to accumulate by competition amongst themselves. Forced constantly to accumulate. That's the permanent drive of capital. Moses and all the prophets, as Marx puts it. Accumulate, accumulate. That's the driving force of the circuit of capital. What's the driving force of the circuit of labour power? It's different. It's the need of the workers. All the needs of the workers. The needs, obviously immediate material needs to have clothing and food and housing and so on, but also the need to develop. The need to develop themselves. The things that Marx talked about as far back as his economic and philosophical manuscripts. The need for self-development of workers. And the reproduction of workers is driven by something which actually brings them constantly into opposition to capital. Because the need of the workers confronts the need of the workers for their own self-development, for more free time, and so on, confronts the demand of capital for more of their time, more of their energy, less workers need more wages, capital needs to pay them less wages. Wherever capital and labour meet in their circuits, there's opposition, potential for conflict. The two circuits are opposed. I mean, we say capitalism is opposed to the economics of need. And of course, this needs to be systematically developed in a sense. Now, the circuit of labour power includes all sorts of things which, of course, we discuss in our politics. The world of the family, the world of education, of culture, and so on and so on. And this is a world which is partly created by workers. It's very important that we stress constantly that things like the family, for example, are not simply created by capital and imposed on workers. Workers create family organizations out of their own needs and so on, constrained by capitalism, constrained by wages, constrained by the lower opportunities for women workers, for example, to get jobs, to get decent jobs, to get good pay, etc., etc. But constrained by the lack of provision for children, for bringing up children within capitalism and so on. But nonetheless, workers create, within those constraints, their own institutions and so on. They create their own organizations, political and trade union organizations and so on, fundamentally in opposition to capital, out of the needs generated in the circuit of labour power. Now, I don't want to say any more about this book because I've got to move on, and I'm almost out of time already. There's a mass of issues that need to be developed. I'll just list them and just refer to them. There's the whole issue of the contradictory consciousness of the working class, for example, which would need to be discussed further and developed in it. The forms of struggle of workers would need to be critically developed in this. I mean, Marx at various points in Capital already discusses such things as cooperatives, trade unions, the need of workers to understand that politics is part of the struggle against capital, and so on, because there were many workers in the 19th century who denied the need for politics and the rest of it. You'll find these arguments in Capital. All of those things, obviously in the light of another century of experience since Marx, would have to be, if it were written today, very, very much more highly developed and so on. And the whole issue of the growth of welfare as an alternative to wages and a supplement to wages also need to be developed. Would have to be pointed out much more explicitly than Marx does that the wage as a form is totally unsuited to need, because a worker with a large family gets the same wage in principle as a worker with no family, and so on and so on. And therefore, the worker who has, and there are many workers who have no wages, pensioners, the unemployed, members of the working class, and so on, who have no wage. The struggle, therefore, of workers to seek to impose on capital other forms of payment of their needs and so on, meeting of their needs through the welfare system. Now, that would obviously take him on to the question of the state, because the question of the state arises when we start to talk about welfare, the welfare state. Now, very quickly on the question of the state then, because I will get stopped. There is a tendency in Capital to treat in Marx's Capital, there's a tendency to treat the process of regulation of capitalism as if it is purely through economic mechanisms. And that is after capitalism has been established. Marx insists in the sections when he talks about what he calls the primitive accumulation of capital, when he talks about how capitalism is first established, he talks about the role of force, of the state, in forcing through the creation of a working class as the basis of capitalism. But then the state disappears from view, really. And clearly, in the light of the last 100 years of experience of capitalism, we have to discuss the state. And it has to be systematically introduced into the whole discussion. Now, how to do it? Rather tentatively, I want to suggest that what we would have to do is to go right back to the beginning of Capital and start again and begin to develop out from the chapter about the commodity, now looking at it in a different way, an argument about law and the state and the place of the state in capitalist society. Begin with commodity production. Only now, instead of tracing out, as it were, the economic side of capitalism, beginning with value and surplus value, we'd have to go in a different direction from the same starting point. Now looking at, as it were, the legal and political side of the same social relations that Marx is analysing when he's talking about commodity production. In other words, we'd have to explore the world of private property. Let me, at this point, I can introduce you to my underground map. This is the underground of capitalist society. This is actually part of the show. I don't know if you can all see it, but Let me explain it very simply. This is the world of private property. As I understand it, it's a simplified representation, I'll explain it, of what Marx means when he talks about the world of commodity production. These circles are called here persons. If any of you have been brought up as Althusserians, you can, if you want to, call them agents. But persons will do for my, or even people, you know, I use such a populist term. These are people, persons, human beings. And these things down here are things. These are all the people in the world. You see that it carries on. But it's a simplified representation of the world population, right? And this is a simplified representation of all the things in the world, right? Now, okay, that so far so good. These red lines represent, in the world of private property, this person needs this thing, but also needs this thing, and also needs this thing, and so on, ad infinitum. And this person, similarly. So all these, the red lines represent people's need for things, okay? There's a problem. No, there would be no problem about this. All societies have got people needing things, and people need lots and lots of things, and always have done in all kinds of societies. In commodity production society, which is the basis of capitalist society, there is a problem. And that is that these blue dotty things, I've drawn them in blue, the suitably Tory colour, which was the only other colour available in the office actually, but never mind, happen to be artistically suitable, represent property relationships. These are round the things and the people are drawn property fences. On each of these, I couldn't draw it in, but there's a little notice saying trespassers keep out. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Trespassers will be kicked by the gamekeeper, or whatever. There are these fences round property. And this is the basis. I mean, Marx assumes all of this, and he doesn't really explain it in the chapter on commodity production, and sometimes people don't understand what's going on there. But this is the world of private property that he's describing in Capital, in the first chapter of Capital. Because in order for this person to get hold of this, A to get hold of this thing which belongs to B, A has to enter into a social relationship with B, where A says, I've got carrots and you've got turnips. I'll give you a carrot if you'll give me a turnip. And he says, well, I don't actually want a turnip. I don't want a carrot, you can piss off. And so he starves to death, basically, for a lack of whatever vitamin, whatever it is you get out of carrots. Treated as the European grain mountain, and this is the Ethiopian population, and you have mass starvation. Right? The property fences say you only get what you need if you can offer the moolah, the money, the value, equivalent to get hold of it. And so there's a systematic process of division of the world into separate things, which are not naturally separated. They're separated by property relationships, both from each other, into discrete parcels. This is his and this is theirs. And people are separated from each other. This is the world of commodity production. Now, this is the starting assumption of liberal economics. This is the starting assumption of Marxist capital. He starts in the same place, the exploration of the same world, the abstracted, the pure world of private property. There's no introduction yet of anything to do with capitalists and workers. This is a presupposition of the world of capitalists and workers. Okay? Now, the question is, how is this regulated? Because there's a problem. There is always a danger that this hungry person will say, I want that carrot, right? And we'll march across, kick down the fence, jump over the fence and nick it like Peter Rabbit, right? Peter Rabbit was the original thief. I'd like to use homely example. Will grab what is not his, as they say. The fences, I mean, all the great classical political theorists of the 17th and 18th and early 19th century, the ones that Marx was grappling with, the political economists and the political theorists tried to show that private property was rooted in nature. They talked about the state of nature. This was what they were representing as the state of nature. Marx is saying this is a historically constituted system and it ain't natural at all. It's in fact deeply unnatural, but never mind. It's merely historical. These fences are not there by nature. They have to be forced there. They're protected by force. Force is required to keep people and their needs apart. Force. And this whole side Out of this, we begin to develop the idea of force. Now, the question is, how are these boundaries to be protected? Well, there are two possibilities. One possibility is what Marx calls club law. And what that basically means is that everybody patrols their own borders, puts up their own burglar alarm, walks around their borders with a club or a gun or an intercontinental ballistic missile, protecting their borders, saying, "Get off of my land," or whatever is the appropriate lingo in the area. Club law. That's one possibility. The other possibility, instead of doing his magic trick, is that an institution arises whose job it is to protect the property fences. I've given it a term called the Queen. It's called the state. It's called Leviathan. It's called all sorts of different... It's the state. These people are constantly at war with each other, constantly needing to be protected from each other because their very system sets them at odds with each other. Out of their interactions, we can derive the other possibility. I want to stress all the time there are two possibilities because I want to come back to club law. Two possibilities. One is a state. A state. Now, as soon as you say a state, then actually you've introduced something entirely new into Marx's economics, into the economics of capital. Because all of these relationships between people in the world of commodity production are relationships of exchange. Always the assumption in exchange is, and Marx accepts this, in exchange, equals are exchanged with equals. There is equivalence in exchange. This state, however, in order to exist, must live. The judges must be paid, the police must be paid, the school teachers, whatever, they've got to be paid. Those bastards down at the DSS, they've got to be paid, and so on. They don't give anything back. There is an exchange between us and the state. What the state does, in order to subsist, firstly, is to collect something from society, surplus from society, in a different form, in the shape of tribute. I mean, it's called tax. It's called taxes. Essentially, it's tribute, which the state collects in order for its, like the mafia, it collects protection money from society and in return offers not to break our windows or set our patisserie on fire or whatever it is. But this is a new kind of economic relationship. If you read Marx's Capital, Volume 3, he's talked about surplus value, and then he talks about how it falls into different categories. That he says, surplus value is the underlying bit. But he says then it's divided up into profit, into rent, into interest, into the profit on commercial capital, and industrial capital, and so on. There's one kind of division that he doesn't discuss at all at that point, which is taxes. He doesn't introduce the question of the state and taxes at all in Capital. It is obviously missing. Now, once you've introduced this, then all sorts of things that we find ourselves talking about today, when we talk about the theory of state capitalism, for example, begin to become possible. Because one of the things that the state can do, because it is an economic actor, but it also isn't an economic actor. It's a political actor, collecting resources from society on a different basis than on the basis of exchange, is tribute, as extra, on the basis of what Marx calls extra economic coercion. The state has resources which it can allocate on different principles. It is possible for a state to do something that no private capital can do, for example. It can prop up capitals which are going bust, like the savings and loan banks in the United States, which are attracting, I heard, $500 billion as an assessment of what it's going to cost to prop up the American equivalent of building societies. It can put money into armaments. It can put money into welfare benefits. It can put money into all sorts of things. Of course, it's limited ultimately by its relationship to the capital. If it does too much of that, nonetheless, there's another economic principle introduced into capital itself at this point. And, of course, another thing which has to be said is because this is not strictly what Marx means by a market economic transaction between society and the state, this is the basis, we have here the basis for all the reformist and Stalinist and so-called orthodox Trotskyist illusions in the state as something different from capitalism, not part of capitalism, and so on and so on. Okay, last thing, and then I'll shut up. There's nothing in this which says that the state has got to be the state, a singular, one state. Because this goes on, marching on across the world, certainly as far as Booth Street's tube station in my diagram. The whole population of the world, there is no reason whatever why there must be one state. Most of the Marxist theorists of the state are very peculiar because they're always deriving something which doesn't exist, the capitalist state. In practice, there's no, this is why, I learn away in the corner, there's no reason why there shouldn't be more than one state. In fact, the reason that there is more than one state, you can't derive logically from the categories of capital. Essentially, capitalism grew up in a world which was already constituted as a self-serious system of states and proto-states, and it inherited that system of states and proto-states, and it developed it and transformed it, and it has grown up in a world of many states and turned it into what we call the nation-state system. But all of those states develop because they stand over society, they tax society, they live off society, they rule society, they exploit society in important senses. All of those states develop, as it were, an interest in their area. New boundaries actually get drawn, called countries, and they do put fences up at that point everywhere. And there are border controls and passport controls and so on, and import controls and export controls, and goodness knows what sorts of controls between states, and the states themselves stand in relationships also of competitive antagonism with each other. I mean, now I'm really having to rush. And the relationships between them are relationships governed by club law. The relationships ultimately between the states, there is no state above the states. The United Nations is a soup cube. It is not a state. None of the organizations, supranational, supra-state organizations, are really states in any proper sense. And the states govern their relationships with each other by club law, through war and military spending and defense and so on and so on. I think I have to shut up for a moment. There's a lot more to develop. All the ramifications of the state, how in fact democracy can arise in this, what rights mean within capitalism, the characteristics of the state, the increasing entanglement of bureaucracy in the state under capitalism, and the theory of state capitalism, and so on. So all of this would have to be developed further. The book on the state, like the book on wage labour, would have to be a very long book. There is finally, and I think this is not so difficult to see, obviously there must be a book also on the world economy. I'm not even going to attempt to talk about that. I've run out of time, but thanks for your patience. Okay, comrades. Right, let me start with the simplest of the questions. The comrade at the back asked me if I was going to have a go at this, and the answer is yes. Should I, which is the question which is asked about Karl Marx, should I do so? I don't know. I'm going to anyway. There's something, I'm not going to try and justify it, but I'm going to anyway. But I don't know whether I will ever finish and so on. Pete Green tells me I never will, but never mind. There's one very important question which I was asked by Sandra from Canada very early on in the questions about something which I did not develop and should have developed because it is absolutely crucial. And that is, of course, when Jonathan says this is the world of Paul, he's quite right. I don't think we therefore say it's irrelevant. What we have to say is this is not a representation of capitalism. It's a representation of commodity production. It is, if you like, another way of representing Chapter 1. Now, if all we got to Chapter 1, we would, when Marx published a contribution to critique of political economy in 1859, I think it was, nobody took the slightest bit of interest. And most people, if they go and read it, think, bloody hell, this is boring, it's utterly irrelevant, etc. And indeed, you could say that about this. However, what Marx then goes on and shows is that out of the presuppositions of commodity production, there is a development. He follows through the meaning of money and commodities and how out of this you derive capital and therefore, and class antagonism and the world of capitalist production that Pete insists I don't believe exists and Pete thinks is not as important as community purpose. I don't know where to get all that from. Never mind. connect it with the strangest thing. The point is precisely that persons no longer remain persons. There has to be a conceptual development whereby persons become tactful. The owners of property are no longer abstractly owners of property, they are of course capitalists. Things, we have to remember, comes to include in the development of capitalism the crucial commodity, labour power. People are made into things that whose capacities are sold as things on the labour power market and so on. Of course, actually you can't derive the state. As I was saying, there are two possible solutions, club law and the state. Until you get to classes, in the exposition of this, you can't actually say there has to be a state. Of course the state is necessary precisely because of class society. I'm saying that at the beginning of an understanding of its place in capitalism, this is perhaps a useful place to start. It is not the destination, for heaven's sake. And I want to be absolutely, I don't want to be misunderstood on that, and Sandra's question is absolutely right. I simply ran out of time. I did intend to develop that. That's the one thing that I really should have got in. Now, everything else is my differences with Hal Draper. I mean, the article in the latest journal on Hal Draper, I have absolute agreement with. I mean, I think that the comrade, I've forgotten the comrade's name from the bookshop, Steve, is absolutely right. And he pins Draper down beautifully. You know, I agree. That's fine, no problem. Okay, let's get to the real nitty-gritty. You see, Pete says, I think that labour reproduction is it must be given equal weight with, the circuit of reproduction of labour must be given equal weight with the circuit of reproduction of capital. I don't think that at all. There is a reason for the order. The dominant relationships in our society are the relationships of capital. The dominant circuit is the relation of capital. It's absolutely essential to insist on that. That's the first thing. I mean, not simply in terms of the production in the production process, the whole movement of money in the world, of capital, every part of the circuits of capital suffuses workers' lives, dominates workers' lives, throws workers out of jobs, creates famines, etc., etc. No, I mean, that I'm quite clear about. And secondly, I don't in any sense want to derive from this some daft argument that community politics is of equal weight with the organised battles of workers in the factory. On the other hand, I will say, you'll find very little in Marx's Capital about the fight in the factory. I'm saying we need to theorise that. Why it is so important, how in fact the working class develops precisely, with that as the core of its struggle, and how we have constantly to react back. Of course, I don't want to disagree at all. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, for heaven's sake. You might doubt it, but particularly in my branch, I know they doubt it, but never mind. I still think I am, and I'm proud to be a member. At least to be allowed to be a member, and so on. Now, the other things, the comrade asked me about the question of the world economy. I mean, the question is too large for me to answer. Let me just say that I think that the assumption that Marx makes, the little remark Marx makes in the preface to Volume 1 of Capital, when he says, the rest of the world should look at England, because you will all follow the same road. We would have to say, Marx would have had to say, when he came to look at the question further, I think I'll rewrite the preface to Volume 1 in the next edition, because it wasn't true. It turns out, of course, when we look at the real history of capitalism, not to be true. Because we have, reference has been made to such people as Luxemburg and Lenin and Gramsci and Cliff and so on. I want to be absolutely clear. In anything I develop here, I stand on the shoulders of giants who have gone before. Little pygmy Colin stands on the shoulders of giants in discussing this. I couldn't have even constructed that without Cliff having developed the theory of state capitalism, without Lenin having written State and Revolution, and so on. Of course. Now, Trotsky developed something which is absolutely fundamental to our politics. In 1905, he put forward for the first time the theory of combined and uneven development. You can't begin to grasp the question of the world economy without grasping the question of combined and uneven development. That capitalism is not grasping the world all at once, it's spread out. You have to introduce in the discussion of the world economy something which up to then has not been in capital, which is that actually the time and space, if you like, in capital is not homogeneous, that actually capitalism has to be located in history. And the history is precisely, Trotsky's wonderful remark, the one law of history is the law of combined and uneven development. That would have to be a central organising theme of a book on the world economy. I don't want to go into the discretion of people like Wallerstein and so on. It would be too complicated at this moment. Okay, lastly, the question which Sue asked me. You see, of course I agree. In one sense I agree. And when I say it, I think we all of us stand on the shoulders of magnificent contributions that should be made in the 20th century to the Marxist understanding of the world. You know, including from comrades in our own organisation, actually. I mean, I think we shouldn't underestimate the contribution that comrades like Cliff and Chris and Alex and so on has made to the development, not simply the defence, but the development of Marxism in our own period. I mean, Cliff stands supreme in this respect, but you know, we should not underestimate. We should be trumpeting abroad the theoretical achievements of our own tendency rather more than we do. And we should, you know, it seems to me. And I borrow heavily from this. At the same time, I have to say, our theory is developed in a one-sided way, in some way. I mean, you know, Cliff's theory of state capitalism is fundamental to all my thinking about the world, I have to say. I mean, at the same time, I have to say, you know, he never located it back properly into Marxism. I mean, there are all sorts of... if the theory were further developed, we might win more people over, because we need to trace the systematic interconnection sometimes. You know, because he's arguing with a particular tradition, he's not arguing with another tradition, and so on. Of course, and we need to do all of that, and sometimes we have to go backwards in the theory. Sometimes you have to go right back to the law of value to understand Cliff's arguments about arms competition. Because you won't find in Marx that military competition can take some form which is like value competition. You have competition in the form of value. All of that you have to trace it through in order sometimes to win an argument with somebody. And so I think that what I'm suggesting, the style of thinking I'm suggesting, is not illegitimate. I think it is proper. It may be that any particular conclusion I might myself come to will prove to be absolutely balmy. I mean, I fully accept that risk. But the project of theorizing, which sometimes involves going back to very abstract questions, it seems to me is something which is a proper part of the development of Marxism. And it is absolutely necessary. The comrade referred to mechanical Marxism. I think that the fight against mechanical Marxism and against Stalinist versions of Marxism involves us in a return to the basics. I'm glad to use the word base here. To the basics of Marxism, to basic concepts, and arguing we have to go back there in order to we have to defend Marxism against attacks from the bourgeoisie, from bourgeois thinkers, from so-called radical thinkers like Mann and Giddens and so on. And again, it involves us in returns, as it were, to the discussion of quite abstract questions as well as immediate concrete questions. I mean, I'm not suggesting that I'm not proposing that the entire organisation should engage in any such activities I've been discussing this morning. I'm not. I mean, I don't think it would be stupid. I do want to say that there is a case for it, though. I think there was a case for Marx going off to the British Museum and writing Capital. I'm glad he did. I'm enriched, and I think we are all enriched, and I think the workers' movement was enriched by his doing so. I'm not claiming anything, you know, I don't have a boily bum. And I'm not claiming anything, any kinship in that sense with Marx. But it seems to me that the activity is justifiable, and it isn't enough just to say, well, you know, we've made a lot of advances and that's enough. Thank you anyway.